2 years ago, I reviewed a monitor from AOC that had a 23.8-inch form factor, 1440p resolution, and 165Hz refresh rate. It was very much the thing that a lot of people were looking forward to, and AOC certainly delivered. And now the manufacturers come out with another monitor that really ups the ante. It's called the AOC Gaming Q25G4SR, which sports a flat 24.5-inch IPS panel that has a resolution of 1440p, but get this, a refresh rate of 300Hz. It also has support for adaptive sync technologies and HDR. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for £240. And in this review, you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and, of course, how it performs across the board. So to kick things off, let's talk about the monitor's input lag, and here I was left really impressed across the board. Very much the same sort of comments could have been said about its predecessor. Indeed, while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, my mouse inputs were responding instantaneously on the monitor, and therefore hardcore competitive gamers alike will very much be pleased to hear about that. Now, it is worth bearing in mind over here that the low input lag mode was enabled via the monitor's OSD. No idea why you'd ever want to disable it. However, with that said, if you were to enable adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, it will grey out the option. Now, from my own subjective testing with adaptive sync technologies, or more specifically NVIDIA G-Sync in my case, I found that the monitor was still perfectly playable. Although if you just want the utmost input lag and therefore not being hindered in the slightest, I'll definitely suggest disabling adaptive sync technologies. There's also another variety of reasons why you might want to do that, in other words, getting the best sort of total system latency and also getting the highest refresh rate possible, but that's a topic for another video. Now, moving on from that, we have to talk about its overall response time. And here's where things get a little bit convoluted. Now, for me to share my experiences, I'm going to give you some objective numbers, and I'm going to be using the OSRTD tool. First off, you should know that via the monitor's OSD, you've got a few different overdrive modes that you can select from. You've got off, fast, faster, and fastest. You've also got the extreme mode, although I'll be touching upon that further down. Now, in the faster mode preset, and yes, that is one off the maximum mode, at 300Hz, you'll be able to see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen the average initial time. This translates to the average G to G that most manufacturers claim, and it's sat at a pretty respectable 3.99 milliseconds. However, what is not impressive is the percent in window, sitting at close to 57%. In other words, this monitor is not really achieving the 300Hz refresh rate window. Now, to improve that, you can go on the fastest mode overdrive, and yes indeed, the percent in window increases to 73%, making it far more acceptable for an LCD panel. However, the average initial time also drops down to 2.77 milliseconds, which is very much great to see. However, what you will be able to see is the RGB overshoot becomes unbearable. Yes, indeed, towards the middle of your screen, there's a lot more error, and therefore means that the monitor becomes pretty much unplayable on its fastest mode overdrive, therefore making this sort of test irrelevant. So I thought to myself, how can I actually get around this? Well, the simple solution was to just drop the refresh rate. And I know some people will be saying, why would you ever do that? Well, I actually think 240Hz is still plentiful. And yes, indeed, while running at 240Hz on its faster mode overdrive, you can see over here that the percent in window is far better at 73%, with the average initial time being very good at 3.74 milliseconds, and the RGB overshoot pretty much minimal to non-existent. Yet again, we have the same issues on its fastest mode overdrive, where the percent in window becomes better and the average initial time drops down slightly, but yet again over here, the RGB overshoot becomes unplayable. To demonstrate this in a visual sense, you can see the UFO ghosting test, and its fastest mode overdrive means that you got quite a lot of inverse ghosting. At least in my case, I found it not usable in a game such as Destiny 2 or indeed a game such as Counter-Strike 2. If you can bear with it, then of course feel free to use this monitor on its fastest mode overdrive at 300Hz. But effectively, what I'm trying to convey over here is that for you to utilize this monitor and for it to actually be achieving the refresh rate that it's actually saying, then you might want to dial it down to 240Hz and run it on its faster mode overdrive. This will give you the best sort of capabilities of the monitor, all while giving you the best sort of visual experience as well. Speaking of which, this brings me on to motion blur reduction, MBR for short. And yes, you can enable it at 300Hz or 240Hz among the other refresh rate ranges that are available on this monitor. And here, you will be pleased to know that you can run MBR independently from the overdrive modes. So for example, you can have the faster mode overdrive, which is the one I would suggest, with the MBR set to the level 1 to level 20. The higher you go, the lower the overall brightness will be. And I'll be touching upon the overall brightness levels further down in this video. However, if you just want a shortcut as such, you can go on the extreme mode overdrive. And yes, this effectively dials the MBR at its maximum level, which is level 20, and on its fastest mode overdrive, which is again not the one I would recommend. But just for your overall indication of how it performs, you can see here the UFO ghosting test. And yes, the UFO becomes a lot clearer with the extreme mode overdrive, and therefore makes it much better when it comes to motion blur reduction. Speaking of which, I was also able to run MBR simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, and this is because the monitor manufacturer has provided you something called MBR sync, allowing you to run the technologies in tandem. And from my own experiences, it was certainly appreciated, because it improved the overall motion clarity, all while giving me a tear-free gaming experience in more casual games. Now, the only caveat to this is that the MBR sync will lock the overall brightness, and you haven't got those MBR levels and brightness modes that you can choose from. From my own testing, I found that it was perfectly bright in a pretty light room. However, in a completely pitch black environment, I did find it a little bit too bright. But of course, that's quite subjective. Now, this does actually bring me onto AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. And here you've got a VRR range from 48 up to 300 Hz. I was able to use the monitor with NVIDIA G-Sync while connected over DisplayPort and HDMI. Yes, indeed, this is because the monitor has got HDMI 2.1 ports and therefore gives you VRR support. That's certainly very good to see and yet again quite impressive at this price point. I didn't encounter any sort of flickering or black screen issues while running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. Furthermore, I was able to play a game such as Destiny 2 at 300 Hz or 240 Hz at 1440p and also with HDR enabled. Now, the overall HDR reproduction of this monitor is nothing to shout about. In fact, it's got the lowest tier of Display HDR 400 certification, which therefore means that the monitor doesn't get overly bright and therefore is not going to give you a kind of a lifelike reproduction. Nonetheless, the overall HDR signal input is appreciated because it can be used in a variety of different scenarios, and the fact that the monitor does get its peak brightness in HDR modes means that you might want to actually enable it. Given the fact it's also got that Display HDR certification, means that if you're going to be running it on the Display HDR mode, via the HDR modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD, you'll get the best sort of color reproduction. You can also go on the different modes, for example the movie or game mode, and therefore give you better brightness, but I found that the overall color accuracy did take a little bit of a hit in said modes. On the notion of using HDR, it actually brings me onto console gaming, because it's something that you might want to have enabled. And furthermore, it's great to see that the monitor will natively support 1440p at 120Hz over HDMI, as I did mention before. In fact, you've even got a dedicated console mode per se via the HDMI inputs, and this can be selected via the monitor's OSD. Here you will also be pleased to know that you can run different refresh rates or indeed resolutions. You'll also be able to run VRR thanks to the fact that you've got those HDMI 2.1 ports, and also you've also got a 4K signal input. So for example, if you've got a Blu-ray player or more legacy device, it can feed through a 4K signal and convert it into 1440p, therefore downscaling the image. Great thinking from the manufacturer and giving it good sort of versatility no matter what you're using it with. Now, concentrating back on the overall console usage, I put it through its paces using the OSRTT tool. And here on its faster mode preset, which is the one I would suggest, the percent in window sits at a stonkingly high 93%, while the average initial time, which translates to the average D2G, sits at just 3.48 milliseconds. At 60 Hz, yet again at the faster mode overdrive, the percent in Windows sits at the perfect 100% and the average initial time at 3.46 milliseconds. Here you can see that the overall motion clarity is much better at 120 Hz as you might come to expect. And yes, in case you're wondering, you can also use MBR, in other words motion blur reduction technologies, on its faster mode preset, and therefore at 120 Hz. However, at 60 Hz, it's not available. Yet again over here you've also got the extreme mode preset that you might want to enable, although bear in mind over here it will dial it to its maximum overdrive, therefore as you'll be able to see incurring quite a lot of inverse ghosting. And in case you're wondering why I didn't provide any numbers on its fastest mode overdrive, well, it's simply redundant, because at its fastest mode overdrive, both at 120 Hz and 60 Hz, the monitor becomes unplayable because you've got so much overshoot. So the monitor's gaming credentials are pretty impressive, but what about when it comes to your overall image quality? Well, as a reminder, you have got a flat 24.5-inch IPS panel with a matte coating to it. you've actually got a pixel density of roughly 120, and that's actually pretty good, therefore meaning the overall text clarity is going to be pretty sharp. And it's going to be definitely important for those people who are going to be using this monitor for productivity's sake. Just bear in mind that you're not going to have as much real estate to work with in comparison to, for example, a 27-inch form factor, which is a bit more of the norm for the 1440p resolution. And in terms of the overall color accuracy, it's great to see that you've got a dedicated sRGB mode that you can select via the monitor's OSD, and you've also got full brightness controls. Now in said mode, I noticed a gamut coverage of 94.6% and a gamut volume of 97.1%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average LTE sits at 1.33 with a maximum of 4.4. So yes, indeed, this monitor is pretty good in terms of color grading and image editing work, although not exactly the best. This tested contrast ratio sits at 1268 to 1, while its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sits at 5750 Kelvin at 100%, therefore being a little bit off. However, the gamma curve is actually pretty much bang on to the 2.2 standard. Effectively, the monitor is actually pretty color accurate and does a pretty decent job, although if you've got a calibrator then you can get the utmost from this monitor. Furthermore, if you do want to use this monitor for gaming purposes and you're not going to be an image editor or video grader, then you might want to consider going on the panel native mode. This will give you a little bit of extra pop from your image, all while sacrificing the overall sRGB color accuracy. Now I did mention we'd be talking about brightness, and here in HDR I clocked in a peak of 457 nits. However, in the display HDR mode it sat at 428 nits. In terms of its SDR brightness, it does actually get pretty bright at 375 nits, therefore meaning that it's perfectly usable in a bright sunlit room, and you can use it at roughly 60 to 70% brightness, at least from my own use case. In terms of the MBR20 Extreme mode brightness, it gets all the way down to 90 nits, and therefore means that with the MBR mode you might want to go on, say, the level 10 mode in order to get a little bit of a higher brightness, and in this respect the brightness will actually be locked depending on the mode that you're actually selecting. As for its minimum brightness, it's fantastic to see that it gets all the way down to 48 nits, therefore showing good sort of range, and therefore making this monitor very much usable in a completely pitch black environment. Now as for the overall brightness uniformity, my tested panel, which I do appreciate is somewhat lottery, actually did a tremendous job across the board. Furthermore, in terms of the overall backlight bleed, I found it perfectly acceptable. These images were taken in a completely pitch black environment at different angles. And yes, there might be a little bit of bleed that is present, but I found it perfectly fine, even if you're going to be playing more pitch black games or indeed movies. Moving on from these tests, I would like to talk about the overall build quality, and here you've got a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. It's great to see that the monitor stand is not garish and indeed pretty small in terms of the overall form factor. Furthermore, the stand itself provides you the right sort of ergonomic controls with height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. In fact, you can rotate it both ways, which is also a nice little touch. If for some reason you do not want the built-in stand, you can replace it with a VESA-compatible stand instead, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now at the back of the monitor you might have noticed there's no silly RGB lights, and I'm all for that. However, what you will be able to notice is that there's no joystick button. Instead, to access the monitor's OSD, they can be done via a set of physical buttons that are found at the bottom right-hand side. This actually makes it pretty intuitive to use. Here, the monitor's OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and provides you all the right options that you require. Furthermore, you've got an extension to this via the AOC G menu software, therefore allowing you to adjust certain settings on the fly if you so wish. Now to conclude, I would like to talk about connectivity, and as I did mention before, you've got those two HDMI 2.1 ports and that singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, therefore all of them allowing you to output the maximum refresh rate and resolution. Furthermore, you've also got a 3.5mm jack output, allowing you to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor, which is something that you might want to do because the two 2-watt speakers are a little bit tinny. They'll suffice for basic music listening and Windows notifications, of course. Elsewhere, I would also like to highlight that you've not got a USB hub, which doesn't bother me in the slightest, but just something I thought I should highlight in this video. So with all that in mind, can I see myself recommending the AOC Gaming Q25G4SR? Well, hopefully I've made it clear that throughout this review I've actually been left really impressed. Sure enough, it doesn't quite hit that 300Hz refresh rate range, and it also has got quite a lot of inverse ghosting at its maximum overdrive setting. However, if you were to dial it down to its faster mode overdrive and also down to 240Hz, you're still getting a stonkingly good product. Yes indeed, those people that are looking for 300Hz might be left a little bit disappointed, but 240Hz would certainly suffice for even hardcore gamers. And here you're getting good sort of response time, fantastic motion clarity, and also a strongly good input lag. And therefore meaning this monitor is still pretty unique with that 24.5-inch form factor and that 1440p resolution. Then, just to add on top of that, you have got MBR, which can also be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies. You've got HDR, adaptive sync technologies, where the latter will also work over HDMI, which is quite nice to see, namely if you're a console gamer. Then you've also got decent color accuracy, a comprehensively laid out OSD, and also a very ergonomic stand. All of which come in at just £240, meaning that if you're looking for a small form factor 1440p monitor, then this monitor should be an absolute no-brainer. And as a result of that, it easily gets my Best Buy awards. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and how you feel it compares with some larger alternatives out there. Now if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.